Jesus is the answer. That's what the church sign proclaimed as Gary and I drove by it the other day. Jesus is the answer, to which I immediately remarked, but what is the question? I've always understood this phrase as implying that Jesus is the answer to every question we could ever ask. Jesus is the answer to every problem we face. Jesus is the answer to every longing that's in our hearts and every difficult decision we need to make. Jesus is the answer, period. How I wish it were that easy. How I wish that all we needed to say was Jesus and everything would fall into place. But Jesus is not the answer to every question we could ever ask. How do I pay my bills this month? Jesus. What kind of car should I buy? Jesus. See what I mean? It doesn't work that way. Jesus is not the answer to every question we could ever ask. In fact, our gospel lesson tells us that Jesus is not an answer to a question. He is a path we need to follow. Let me repeat that. Jesus is not an answer to a question. He is a path we need to follow. But before we get to the path, we need to follow. And Jesus begins by asking a question: who do people say that I am? Jesus and his disciples are in Caesarea Philippi when he asks them this question, and this is an important detail in the story. I visited the site of this ancient city, and its setting is quite dramatic. There's a very high stone cliff face in front of where this ancient city used to stand. And in this cliff face, there is a large cave from which a crystal clear spring flows. Carved into the face of this cliff are little niches where statues of the gods used to be placed. Originally, the city was called Panias to honor the Greek god Pan. His statue stood in one of those niches, along with the Canaanite god Baal and other Greek deities. Eventually, this city was conquered by the Romans, and Herod Philip, the son of Herod the Great, built an administrative capital building there and renamed it Caesarea Philippi, in honor of himself, of course, as well as Julius Caesar. So imagine Jesus and his disciples are sitting somewhere in front of this massive stone cliff, and it's filled with statues of the gods and goddesses of the day. And it's also a place that represents the power of the Roman occupation of the region. And surrounded by all these symbols of authority and influence, Jesus asked the question, who do people say that I am? And as he asked this question, I imagine his disciples acting like little school kids taking a test. You know, they want to get the right answer. They want to please Jesus, and so they start raising their hands and shouting out answers. Ooh, Jesus, me first. Some say John the Baptist. And I can hear Jesus laughing. Well, that would be quite a feat considering our beloved brother John was beheaded by Herod Antipas. Another disciple raised his hand. Well, some think you're Elijah or one of the prophets. Jesus smiles and replies, well, you're getting warmer, but you're not quite there yet. So who do you say what I am? You've heard what others think of me, but what's your personal opinion? Well, Peter raises his hand and shouts, I know. You are the Messiah. And Jesus puts his finger to his lips and tells them, keep this a secret. Shh. It would appear that this is the answer that Jesus was looking for. But what happens next shows that the conversation was not quite finished yet. Peter tells Jesus that he is the Messiah, which in Greek is the Christ, and both of these words mean anointed one. What Peter envisions by his answer is that Jesus will be the one to topple all the symbols of power which surrounded them. The old gods and goddesses will be history. Pan and Baal will no longer be worshipped. The Roman occupation will come to an end, and the Israelites will be free once again. Peter basically envisions a military coup, and perhaps renaming Caesarea Philippi to Jesusville to show that there's a new sheriff in town. Now, Peter does not say these things out loud, but Jesus seems to know what he is thinking. Perhaps this is the reason why he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone. They still failed to produce the right answer to this question, who do you say that I am? So Jesus begins to clarify Peter's answer. He tells his disciples that he must undergo great suffering. and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes. Then he's going to be crucified, and after 3 days he will rise again. And I'm sure at this point you could have knocked Peter over with a feather. This is not what Peter had in mind when he told Jesus that he was the anointed one. So Peter took Jesus aside and he began to rebuke him. Jesus, what are you talking about? Why did you bring us to this place if you're not going to start a revolution? You are not going to suffer. No one is going to kill you. Stop saying these foolish things. Then Jesus gives Peter one of the biggest verbal backhands in the New Testament. Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Ouch. You know that had to hurt. Jesus was saying that Peter was not acting like a disciple, but like an enemy. Apparently, it wasn't enough that Peter had the right answer to the question. It was equally important that Peter understood what this answer meant. Well, let's pause for a moment and think about what all of this means to us. I just threw a lot of history at you. We may be more connected to this story than we realize. As disciples of Jesus, we must also answer this question: who do you say that I am? Over the years, we've heard lots of people give very different answers to this question. We've all listened to pastors share their scholarly and personal opinions regarding who Jesus is. We've probably read some books on the subject and maybe discussed it in a class or two. We've also heard lots of public dialogue where a million different answers to this question have been offered. And everyone who makes an attempt to answer this question wants to get it right. Not surprisingly, though, in trying to get it right, we, like Peter, mold Jesus into who we need him to be. Jesus becomes a political revolutionary, or a social activist, or a flag-waving American, or a healer of all that ails us, or a handyman who's going to fix all of our problems, and so on and so forth. As we attempt to answer the question, who do you say that I am? We may come up with a really good answer, but like Peter, we are often guilty of wanting to tell Jesus who he needs to be and what he needs to do for us. Is it any wonder that Jesus rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on divine things, but on human things." And I have the sneaking suspicion that we are often guilty of doing the same thing. Instead of letting Jesus mold our lives into what he wants us to be, we want to mold Jesus into what we want him to be. Get behind me, Satan, indeed. But thankfully, Jesus doesn't leave things with a sharp rebuke hanging in the air. Instead, he reminds the disciples as well as us that he is not an answer to a question. He is a path we need to follow. If any want to become my followers, Jesus said, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. This well-known response reminds us that there is not one right answer to the question, who do you say that I am? And just about the time we think we have Jesus figured out, he goes in a different direction altogether. Our answer to this question, who do you say that I am, will change over time based on life experience and our growth as disciples of Jesus. And if Jesus teaches us anything today, it is the spiritual truth that what is important is not that we have the right answer, but that we answer the call to follow. If any want to become my followers, Jesus said, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. This reminds us that the path Jesus wants us to follow is not an easy one. Our goal is not to mold Jesus into who we need him to be. Our goal is to follow his example of service and sacrifice. Jesus is not the military Messiah who will conquer those whom we label as our enemies. He's not the bully club we use to beat up those whose answer to the question is different from ours. Instead, Jesus is the anointed one who walked a path of servanthood and sacrifice and calls us to do the same. What would the church look like if we stopped arguing over the question, who do you say that I am? and started putting the needs of others before our own? Can we feed the multitudes without asking for their political or religious affiliation? Can we welcome immigrants, refugees, and the homeless as if they are our long lost friends? What would we look like if we stopped molding Jesus into our image and let him mold us into his? Can we pull it off? Can we live a life of sacrifice and servanthood? Can we keep our know-it-all attitudes in check? So many questions come from this one seemingly simple question: who do you say that I am? I hope we've learned that Jesus is not a question to be answered. Instead, he is a path we need to follow. Amen.